It started with a scream, one single piercing scream that cut through the joyous noise of New Year's Eve in New Orleans. In an instant, the celebration turned into chaos. Bourbon Street, usually the heartbeat of the city's festivities, was packed with thousands. Friends were toasting, lovers were kissing, and strangers were laughing together, united in the magic of the night. But amidst the crowd was a truck, its engine rumbling, its driver motionless, and its headlights casting an eerie glow on the revelers who had no idea what was about to happen. At exactly midnight, as the crowd erupted in cheers to welcome the new year, the truck surged forward. It plowed through the packed streets, scattering people like leaves in a storm. The sound of impact, the screams, and the chaos that followed would haunt the survivors forever. Shoes, shattered glasses, and blood stained the streets that had been so full of life just moments before. But the driver didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. And when it was over, 15 lives were lost, dozens were injured, and a city was left shattered. Who was the man behind the wheel? What kind of darkness drove him to commit such an unspeakable act? And what clues lay hidden in the wreckage, clues that would shock even the most seasoned investigators? This is the story of how one man turned joy into terror and left an entire city searching for answers. The day had started like any other New Year's Eve in New Orleans. The streets were alive with the energy of people preparing to ring in the new year. Bourbon Street, with its neon glow and pulsating rhythm of jazz, had drawn crowds from all over. The air was thick with the smell of food, alcohol, and the sweet scent of anticipation. But as the sun began to set, a strange unease hung in the air, unnoticed by the revelers lost in their celebration. By 10 p.m., the crowd had reached its peak. Shoulder to shoulder, laughter echoing off the buildings, and the sound of party horns blending with the vibrant music spilling from the bars. New Orleans had always been a place where the ordinary met the extraordinary, but that night the city would experience something beyond its wildest nightmares. As the countdown to midnight began, people spilled into the streets, their faces illuminated by the flickering glow of fireworks overhead. In the distance, a lone pickup truck sat idling, its engine purring, hidden in plain sight. At exactly 12:01 a.m., as the clock struck midnight, the joyous cries of Happy New Year filled the air. But in the next moment, that same cheer turned into pure panic. The truck, which had been parked mere yards from the celebrations, suddenly roared to life. Tires screeched as it tore down Bourbon Street, plowing through the mass of people. The truck barreled into the crowd at full speed, its headlights flashing before the impact. Screams of shock and terror rang out, drowning the sounds of music. Bodies were hurled through the air as the truck collided with them. The noise was deafening. The crash, the metal grinding against human bodies, the sickening sound of glass breaking, and the thud of impact. As the truck sped down the street, people scattered in every direction, leaving behind a trail of blood, shoes, and discarded belongings. A bystander caught in the chaos described it like this: "It all happened so fast. 1 second, everyone was celebrating. The next, there were bodies on the ground, and I could hear people screaming for help. It was like a war zone." The truck didn't stop. It continued its rampage, forcing bystanders to dive out of the way, knocking people to the ground and leaving destruction in its wake. Some tried to run, others tried to help, but the scene was impossible to process. Too much chaos, too many wounded. In those first horrifying moments, it wasn't clear if this was a random act of madness or something much worse. But one thing was certain: the celebration had turned into a bloodied nightmare. Within seconds, emergency sirens filled the air. Ambulances raced to the scene, their lights flashing in stark contrast to the dark streets. Police officers, many of them off duty, rushed toward the carnage, trying to maintain order and clear the area. The normally vibrant atmosphere of Bourbon Street was replaced with an overwhelming sense of dread as the full scope of the attack began to sink in. The first confirmed casualty reports trickled in, and by 12:15 a.m., it was clear the damage was far worse than anyone had anticipated. By the time the authorities could assess the scene, 15 people had been confirmed dead, with over 30 more critically injured. The news spread like wildfire. Social media platforms exploded with images and videos as eyewitnesses shared their experiences. Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook were flooded with posts. I was there. I saw it all. People running for their lives, others lying on the street. It's like something out of a nightmare. Is this real? A truck just drove into the crowd on Bourbon Street. New Orleans will never be the same. Emergency personnel worked tirelessly to save as many lives as they could, but the magnitude of the attack made it impossible for every victim to get immediate help. Hospitals throughout the city were flooded with victims, and the city's emergency response system was stretched to its limits. As the morning light began to break over the city, the grim reality set in. The area around Bourbon Street was closed off, barricaded with yellow police tape as investigators began their work. The tragedy had not only left a physical scar on the city, but had also deeply shaken the spirit of New Orleans itself. For those who lived through it, the images were too haunting to forget. Bloodied streets, overturned chairs, shattered glass, and the sound of sirens that seemed to never stop. The celebration had ended before it ever really began, leaving behind a fractured city trying to process the horror it had just endured. As the world learned of the tragedy, the survivors were left grappling with the events they had witnessed. For many, the night would forever be burned into their memory. One woman, who had been standing just a few feet from the truck when it first hit, recalled, "I didn't even understand what was happening at first. One moment, I was cheering with friends, and the next, there was a truck speeding right at us. I saw people being hit. Some were knocked out cold. It felt like the whole world had flipped upside down." Another man, who had managed to dive into a nearby alley to avoid the truck, described the aftermath. "I ran as fast as I could, but I couldn't stop hearing the screams. There was nowhere to hide. When I turned around, I saw people helping each other, but some were just still. I couldn't believe what I was seeing." And then there was the account of a paramedic who had arrived at the scene. "When I got there, the chaos was overwhelming. People were screaming, bleeding. Some weren't even moving. I've been in war zones, but nothing prepared me for this. It was like walking into hell on earth. The worst part, I couldn't even tell how many people were still alive." Each survivor's story was a testament to the horror that had unfolded on Bourbon Street, and each story revealed the resilience and bravery of those who fought to help others amidst the devastation. As the city began to heal, those who lived through it were left not just with physical scars, but with emotional wounds that would take far longer to mend. The pain of watching someone die before your eyes, or hearing the desperate cries of those who didn't make it, was something no one could escape. The aftermath of that night would shape the city of New Orleans forever. But the most haunting question remained: why? What had driven a man to commit such an unfathomable act of violence on a night meant for joy and hope? The name Shamsuddin Jabbar would soon become infamous, but before he was known as the man who drove into a crowd of New Year's revelers, he had lived a life full of struggles, choices, and a gradual descent into a dangerous world of extremism. Jabbar was born in the mid-1980s in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Growing up in a middle-class family, his childhood was unremarkable to most observers. He was intelligent, ambitious, and eager to make something of himself. But personal demons would begin to haunt him from an early age. Jabbar enlisted in the U.S. Army in his early 20s, seeking structure, purpose, and a way out of the mundane life he felt trapped in. However, his time in the military did not last long, and he was discharged after a few years. Despite his service, there is no record of him being deployed overseas, and his military career was short-lived. Following his departure from the military, Jabbar's life became increasingly troubled. Financial difficulties, mounting personal debt, and a series of failed relationships weighed heavily on him. His first marriage ended in divorce, followed by another, each one leaving him more isolated and bitter. He struggled to maintain any semblance of normalcy, resorting to unhealthy coping mechanisms, substance abuse, anger issues, and a growing sense of alienation. It was around this time that Jabbar began to explore his spirituality in a deeper way. What started as a search for meaning would soon take a darker turn. Jabbar became more withdrawn, pulling away from his friends and family. He He spent long hours online, researching extremist ideologies, and gravitated towards radical groups. At first, his conversion to Islam seemed like a personal choice, an attempt to reclaim some sense of control over his life. But soon, the ideals he was exposed to online were not the peaceful teachings of the faith, but the rhetoric of hate and violence. His conversion was marked by a drastic change in behavior. He grew reclusive, stopped attending family gatherings, and became increasingly angry. Friends and colleagues noticed that he had developed a fixation with global politics and radical ideologies. He began to express admiration for violent extremist groups, and his online presence reflected this new mindset. His posts filled with disturbing messages about jihad, violence, and the destruction of Western society. As Jabbar became more entrenched in these extremist views, his personal life continued to spiral. His financial troubles worsened, and his health deteriorated due to substance abuse. He lost jobs, friends, and family connections, leaving him with nothing but a growing sense of resentment towards society. This disillusionment, coupled with his radicalized views, set the stage for the deadly events that would unfold on New Year's Eve. In the months leading up to the attack, there were several key events that hinted at Jabbar's dangerous state of mind. While he tried to keep his life under wraps, some of his actions and behavior were impossible to ignore. First, there were the troubling social media posts. Jabbar had become obsessed with sharing extremist content, including videos and manifestos praising acts of terror. He would often post messages encouraging others to rise up and fight against the oppression of what he called infidels. His messages grew darker with each passing week, increasingly focused on violence and destruction. But it wasn't just the online posts that were alarming. In the final days before the attack, Jabbar rented a truck. This seemingly ordinary decision would become crucial in the execution of his plan. On December 31, 2023, Jabbar rented a white Ford F-150 pickup truck, a vehicle he would use as his weapon. He picked up the truck that morning and drove it to New Orleans, a city known for its vibrant New Year's celebrations. Jabbar had no clear reason for choosing New Orleans. No personal ties, no connection to the city, but it was the perfect location for his twisted plan. The streets were crowded with people, the city alive with the sound of celebration. On New Year's Eve, Jabbar made a chilling final decision. He recorded a video. The video would later be discovered by investigators and sent shockwaves through the public when it was revealed. In it, Jabbar spoke directly to the camera, his face calm, almost detached. He made no attempt to explain why he was about to commit such a heinous act. Instead, he simply described his feelings of alienation, anger, and his belief that this attack was a form of justice. "I am doing this because the world has failed me," Jabbar said in the video, his voice eerily steady. "I am doing this for all those who have been oppressed. This is my way of striking back. The time for change has come. You will remember me." The video ended with Jabbar putting his phone down and walking out of the frame. What followed next was the unthinkable, the truck driving into the crowd, leaving devastation in its wake. This video would serve as a chilling testament to the mindset of a man who felt rejected by society and consumed by a twisted sense of justice. His actions were not random, nor were they impulsive. They were premeditated, cold, and driven by a deep-seated anger that had been simmering for years. As the investigation progressed, authorities learned more about Jabbar's growing isolation and his obsession with radical ideologies. They found evidence of his research into terrorist attacks, as well as communications with individuals who shared his beliefs. But what shocked investigators the most was the realization that Jabbar had been planning his attack for months, carefully choosing New Year's Eve, an occasion for celebration, as the moment to strike. His final days were spent preparing for the attack, and while those around him had no idea of his intentions, the clues were there all along. The rented Ford F-150, the troubling posts, the cryptic video, all pointed to a man who had become consumed by a dangerous ideology and a desire for revenge. In the aftermath of the attack, law enforcement quickly began piecing together Shamsuddin Jabbar's connection to extremist ideologies. What was initially suspected to be a random act of violence soon took on a much darker and more chilling form. investigators discovered the key piece of evidence, an ISIS flag hidden in the bed of the rented Ford F-150 truck. The flag, black with white Arabic inscriptions, was a symbol of Jabbar's radicalization. It suggested a direct connection to the notorious terrorist group, one that has been responsible for a wide range of attacks across the globe. However, the question remained, was Jabbar actually linked to ISIS, or had he simply adopted their ideology as part of his personal crusade? Experts on terrorism and radicalization weighed in, offering differing perspectives. Some analysts argued that Jabbar had likely been self-radicalized. They pointed to his time spent online, his exposure to extremist content, and the disturbing ideological shifts that had marked his behavior. There was no evidence to suggest that Jabbar had direct contacts with ISIS operatives or that he had received instructions from the group. It seemed as though he had absorbed their messaging from afar, becoming increasingly obsessed with the idea of violent retaliation. Other experts, however, believed there was a deeper connection at play. They noted that Jabbar's attack appeared too calculated, too methodical to be purely the work of a lone individual. The ISIS flag, combined with Jabbar's video, suggested he might have been influenced or even recruited by extremist groups, even if there was no formal link. The authorities now turned their focus to the broader question: was Jabbar part of a larger network of like-minded individuals? The analysis of Jabbar's online activity provided further clues. His social media accounts had been filled with posts praising acts of terror and jihad. In one particularly disturbing post, Jabbar shared a video of a car ramming attack, expressing admiration for the attackers and declaring that he too would strike for the cause. His online activity, combined with the disturbing contents of the video he recorded before the attack, painted a clear picture of a man who had embraced the principles of ISIS-style violence. Despite this, the authorities struggled to pinpoint whether Jabbar was genuinely affiliated with ISIS or if he had simply become enamored with their ideology. One thing was clear, though: his motivations were deeply rooted in a desire to cause pain, to strike terror into the hearts of those he viewed as oppressors. This connection to ISIS, whether direct or indirect, would forever define the attack and its aftermath. As law enforcement pieced together Jabbar's history, they found evidence that suggested he had been planning the attack for months. The ISIS flag wasn't just a symbol, it was a message to the world that Jabbar was part of something much larger than his own personal grievances. The flag was a chilling declaration of intent. He wasn't just a lone man in a truck, he was a soldier in a global jihadist movement, seeking revenge for his own personal suffering. The police response to Jabbar's attack was immediate, as officers rushed to the scene of the tragedy on New Year's Day. As the chaos unfolded, Jabbar's location was quickly identified, and law enforcement moved into action to apprehend him. What happened next was a brief but intense confrontation. Jabbar, who had been fleeing the scene in the rented Ford F-150, was soon cornered by a group of police officers. However, instead of surrendering, he chose to escalate the situation. Jabbar opened fire on the officers, initiating a deadly shootout. Law enforcement returned fire, and the exchange lasted several minutes. Witnesses later described the scene as chaotic, with gunfire ringing out as police tried to neutralize Jabbar, who was heavily armed. Despite the efforts to take him into custody, Jabbar was shot multiple times and collapsed at the scene. Within moments, he was pronounced dead from his injuries. The shooting ended his life and his violent spree, but it left the city in shock. The authorities were left to pick up the pieces, trying to understand his motivations and whether there was a larger conspiracy at play. In the days that followed, the FBI took over the investigation, analyzing evidence and attempting to uncover any connections Jabbar might have had with others. Despite finding disturbing evidence, including an ISIS flag and radical social media posts, no direct links to terrorist groups were found. Still, the authorities continued to investigate, carefully piecing together the motivations behind the attack. The people of New Orleans were not prepared for the storm of grief and fear that followed Shamsuddin Jabbar's deadly attack. New Year's Day, typically a day of celebration, was now marked by devastation and heartbreak. In a city known for its festive spirit, the streets that had been filled with revelers now bore the scars of tragedy. Locals, stunned by the violence, struggled to come to terms with what had happened in their beloved city. The families of the victims were left grappling with shock and sorrow. Those who were injured fought to recover, both physically and emotionally. Survivors of the attack were left haunted by the horrific memories of seeing innocent people mowed down by a truck in a split second. It felt like it all happened in slow motion, one survivor recalled, trembling as they relived the moment when the truck barreled through the crowd. The attack, coming so suddenly, had shattered the sense of security that many had felt during the holiday season. But in the midst of the devastation, New Orleans displayed its characteristic resilience. Candlelight vigils were held in honor of the victims, and impromptu memorials sprang up on Bourbon Street where the attack had occurred. Thousands of people gathered to mourn and remember the lives lost, their unity offering some sense of comfort amid the tragedy. The city came together in support of the victims and their families, showing that, while violence had fractured the moment, the spirit of community could begin to heal the wounds. Local businesses, community leaders, and residents rallied together, creating fundraisers to help those affected by the attack. The memorial services were often somber, with flowers, pictures, and messages of solidarity laid out across the streets. The city showed strength through the darkest of times, vowing to rebuild not just physically but emotionally as well. As the lights on Bourbon Street dimmed in the wake of the attack, the community proved that it would not let fear dictate their future. While the attack on New Year's Day shook New Orleans to its core, it also became a reflection of a much larger issue, one that transcended the city and reached the national and even global stage. The rise of lone wolf attacks, where individuals with extremist views carry out violence on their own without the direct aid of organized groups, had been a growing concern for years. These attacks were harder to prevent because, unlike larger organized plots, they were executed by individuals who often showed no clear connection to larger terrorist organizations or cells. Jabbar's attack seemed to fall into this troubling trend. His background suggested that he had been radicalized online, consumed by extremist ideologies, yet there was no concrete evidence linking him to any known terrorist group. He was an individual acting alone, driven by his personal grievances and an increasing sense of isolation. This new breed of radicalization, where the internet becomes a breeding ground for extremist ideas, made it incredibly difficult for authorities to identify and prevent such incidents before they occurred. Experts in counterterrorism and radicalization began to reflect on what had gone wrong in Jabbar's life. His social media posts had contained clear warning signs of violent intent, but they had been dismissed by many as isolated rants. His conversion to Islam, his increasing withdrawal from society, and his purchase of weapons and other gear were all overlooked as potential red flags. The question on many minds was how to better identify individuals like Jabbar before they escalated to violence. Law enforcement agencies and experts began to emphasize the importance of monitoring extremist rhetoric online and identifying individuals who might be at risk of radicalization. They pointed to the need for early intervention, whether through counseling, community outreach, or other methods to address the underlying issues that led to radicalization. Many law enforcement officials believed that the lack of community engagement and social isolation were critical factors in Jabbar's path toward violence. They warned that, while laws and surveillance were essential, they needed to be paired with efforts to build stronger, more connected communities where individuals would feel less inclined to resort to violence. In the wake of the attack, the broader public was left grappling with the question of how to prevent such tragedies. Was there more that could have been done to stop Jabbar before he carried out his horrific actions? Could authorities have acted sooner on his troubling behavior and extremist sympathies? These questions persisted long after the immediate aftermath, and they would continue to drive the conversation on counterterrorism and radicalization for years to come. The New Year's Day attack underscored a terrifying reality. Terrorism could come in many forms, and it was no longer limited to organized groups with clear agendas. The lone wolf attacker, isolated but driven by an unyielding belief in violent ideologies, posed a new kind of threat to society, a threat that required a multifaceted approach to understand and combat. This attack was a chilling reminder that the battle against extremism, while often fought on the global stage, could also be deeply personal. It was a tragedy not only because of the lives lost and the suffering caused, but because it illustrated how deeply such ideologies had penetrated into individuals' lives. The lessons learned from Jabbar's attack would reverberate far beyond New Orleans, influencing future counterterrorism strategies and the ongoing struggle to protect communities from the reach of radicalization. The events of that New Year's Day will forever be etched into the history of New Orleans, a moment that, like so many others, began with celebration but ended in unspeakable violence. As the world grappled with the aftermath, one undeniable truth remained: a community, an entire city, had been shaken to its core. What had been a day meant for joy became one of mourning and reflection. In the blink of an eye, lives were lost, others forever changed, and the peace of a holiday that many look forward to each year was shattered by a truck careening through the heart of Bourbon Street. Shamsuddin Jabbar's life, once full of personal struggles and frustrations, had turned into a haunting example of how isolation, radicalization, and unchecked grievances can lead to violence. But the story doesn't end with him. It extends to the victims, those who survived and those who tragically did not, and to the families who must now live with the scars of that day. It's a story that demands more than just curiosity. It demands action, a reflection on how this happened and what we can do as individuals and as a society to prevent such tragedies from ever unfolding again. As we reflect on Jabbar's disturbing path toward violence, we must also ask ourselves, how did we miss the signs? What can we do to help those who are struggling before they fall into the abyss of extremism and violence? How can communities come together to stop individuals from feeling so isolated, so disconnected, that they resort to such horrifying acts? These are questions we must ask not just after the fact, but before the next tragedy strikes. The case of Shamsuddin Jabbar is a stark reminder that radicalization can take many forms, and it's not always obvious until it's too late. As we look at the way his life ended, with a fatal shootout after his rampage, it leaves us wondering, what could have been done to intervene before it got to that point? Could a community have reached out to him? Could law enforcement have done more? And what role do we all play in preventing these acts of terror from taking root? This isn't just a story about one man's violent outburst. It's a story about the deep cracks in our social fabric, the ignored warning signs, and the ways in which we can all play a part in mending those cracks. It's about preventing future attacks, whether through community outreach, early intervention, or more vigilant monitoring of extremist ideologies before they can escalate. Most of all, it's about remembering the victims and their families and honoring their stories as we ask these critical questions. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this tragic event. What do you think could have been done to prevent such a tragedy? How do you feel about the growing number of lone wolf attacks, and how do we address them as a society? We encourage you to share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. Let's start a conversation and keep this dialogue going. If you found this story impactful, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth true crime investigations. Each week we explore stories like this, untold truths, shocking revelations, and the dark side of human nature. Your support helps us bring these stories to light and gives us the opportunity to dig deeper into the cases that matter. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time on True Crime Uncovered. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and always remember, the truth is out there, and we're here to uncover it.